This is a 2006 Hummer H1 Alpha, and it is the pinnacle of the Hummer, the pinnacle of the off-roader, according to some connoisseurs of giant, ridiculous vehicles like this one. These H1 Alpha models are shooting up in value. They've become tremendously desirable, and today I'm going to explain why. I've borrowed this H1 Alpha from CNC Motors, which is an exotic car dealership here in Southern California that has everything, and I mean everything, from new exotic cars to muscle cars to, well, Hummers like this. They have one of the most amazing inventories of any car dealership, and you can check them out by clicking the link in the description below. Now, before I get into the H1 Alpha, a little background. The original Hummer was a military vehicle that came out in 1984, and it was nicknamed the Humvee because of its military acronym. In 1992, they started selling a civilian version for people who wanted something more ridiculous and insane and crazy than the regular SUVs of the day, like the Toyota Land Cruiser and the Chevy Blazer and the Ford Bronco. Over the years, the Hummer was modernized and updated, but there was always some flaw. The early years of the civilian models didn't have anywhere near enough power. They were incredibly slow. Then later models had okay power, but there was a casting flaw in the engine that could cause engine failure, so there were reliability issues. They didn't fully get it right until the 2006 model year, and the H1 Alpha came out, and it used the Duramax diesel engine from General Motors full-size heavy-duty pickup trucks, which finally gave the Hummer the power, the torque, and the reliability it always needed. Unfortunately, it was immediately canceled. You see, 2006 was the best year of the Hummer H1 because they offered the Alpha with the Duramax engine, but it was also the last year of the Hummer H1, meaning you could only get the Duramax engine for 2006. And these, as a result, have become tremendously desirable and sought after in the used market, with prices approaching $200,000 and beyond for really nice ones. So today I'm going to take you on a tour of the H1 Alpha, and I'm going to show you all of its interesting quirks and features. Then I'm going to get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'm going to give it a Doug score. And for more of my thoughts on the H1 Alpha, click the link below to visit autotrader.com/oversteer, where I've also rounded up a list of some cool and weird off-roader SUVs currently listed for sale on AutoTrader. All right, I'm going to start the quirks and features of the H1 in the most obvious place, and that would be its size, and specifically its width. And as you can see, it's just incredibly wide. This thing is absolutely massively wide, barely fit it in lanes, barely fit it in parking spaces, but it isn't as wide as you might think. I remember this came out when I was a kid, and when you'd see one on the road, it just dwarfed everything else. But these days, this is 86.5 inches wide. A new Ford Raptor is 86.3 inches wide. They're basically the same. The width of full-size and heavy-duty pickups has basically caught up to the width of the Hummer H1, which was at one time considered to be the most massive thing anybody could ever think of. Now, it's just a regular pickup truck, or maybe a little bit wider. But even though the H1's dimensions may mean that it isn't incredibly wide by modern standards, it certainly feels incredibly wide in here. And I say that because you have a seat, and then you have about 4 feet and then you have the seat on the other side of the car. It is absolutely incredible how much width is in this cabin and how much space there is between the driver and passenger seats. So much, in fact, that I, sitting here in the passenger seat, cannot physically touch the driver's seat, even if I lean over and reach as far as I can. That's not something you will see in any other cars. Just an unbelievable amount of width in here. So why does this thing feel so so much wider on the inside than a Ford Raptor? Well, there are a couple of reasons. One is that the sides are at right angles. They're basically 90 degrees straight up, whereas most cars kind of curve in a little bit on the sides. You also have the fact that the H1 has incredibly thin door panels. These door panels don't have airbags in them. They don't have giant armrests with quilted leather. They don't have enough room for cup holders or power window switches. They're just very thin, and that allows this vehicle to stretch its interior and make it seem even wider. But the main reason that it feels so wide in this interior is that there's just barely any room for passengers. When I sit here in the passenger seat, it is unbelievable how little room I have. I can barely sit here and be comfortable. There's basically no passenger space. After all, this thing was originally built for transporting troops in battle, and not a lot of thought was paid to making it luxurious and roomy in here, and that carried on all the way to the end of the Hummer line with the Alpha. There is barely any room. Instead, all of the interior room is taken up with this giant middle section. But anyway, moving on from the massive size and the width of this interior, the next thing you notice when you climb in on the driver's side is the sheer volume of buttons. There are so many buttons and switches all around the driver's seat. It's just crazy looking. But if you look closely, you'll start to notice they're all the same familiar buttons you'd expect. For example, here are the window switches. You can see front and rear, and there's the button to lock the window switches. And you also have the door locks and the heated seats, the windshield wipers, the headlights. You have all of your typical buttons. They're just rather large and all arranged directly around the driver, so it looks a little bit overwhelming. One thing I do like with these switches is that the window switches are in the middle of the front seats between the two seats, and yet this thing is so massively wide that there is another window switch for the passenger side over on the passenger side, also in the middle, because it would be too much to ask the passenger to reach all the way over to touch the middle window controls on the driver's side. Now, with all that said about the buttons and switches, there are some new features in here you wouldn't see on a normal car, and my very favorite is the CTIS system. That's the Central Tire Inflation System, and it is unbelievable. If you're going off-roading, you will typically let some air out of your tires so that they can more easily crawl over rocks and they won't be really inflated and maybe get punctured. Now, in a normal car, you have to get out and air down each individual tire, but in this thing, you can press buttons in the interior right here, and it will automatically deflate your tires to the pressure you want. And here's the incredible thing. When you're done driving on the sand or on your rocky terrain, you can re-inflate the tires using those same buttons automatically. You never have to get outside. The theory being, for combat, you don't want to have to sit there and air up and air down each time you want to drive into certain terrain, so you can all do it from in here. That's amazing. There's also a gauge directly above the CTIS switches that shows your front and rear tire pressures at any given time. Now, next up, another interesting item in this vehicle. In spite of the massive size of the H1 and all of these buttons and switches, the climate control vents are very, very small. Fortunately, there is some good news, namely the driver has 4. Just for the driver. The passenger has an additional 2 climate vents just for the passenger. So the front seat has 6 distinct climate vents, which is something you don't see very often. Another oddly tiny item in this vehicle, again, this is a massive, giant, hulking, muscular off-road SUV, but look at the steering wheel. It looks like something you'd see in an arcade game. It's so tiny and ridiculous and performance-y, and it doesn't match this car at all. But this is the factory Hummer H1 steering wheel. That's what GM put on them. It's too small, it looks ridiculous, but that's what it came with. Now, one interesting item is you'll see there's no airbag in this steering wheel. Airbags were mandated by the US federal government for the 1998 model year. This is a 2006. This vehicle got an exemption from the airbag requirements because it was specialized, low volume, so they didn't have to install airbags in these, and so they never did. No airbags in a Hummer H1. Now, next up, another rather absurd interior detail in the Hummer H1. Drop the sun visor and you will see that it's off-center. The driver and passenger sit so far on the edges of this vehicle that the sun visor doesn't even entirely cover your field of vision. So when you put it down, there's a little extender you can pull out in order to actually fully protect your eyes from the sun, which is very interesting. Another interesting component of the sun visor in this vehicle, when you put it down, you cannot swing it over to the left to block sun coming in from over your shoulder. In most cars you can, but not this one. However, in spite of that, there is still a second auxiliary sun visor. So you can put down the main sun visor and then put down a second sun visor that like covers up any gaps. You won't see that very often. And here's something you'll never see. Above the dual sun visors, there's a storage net. Does your vehicle have a storage net above your two sun visors? I don't think so, unless you have an H1 Alpha. Now, since we're on the subject of rather weird quirks and features of the H1, I want to move on to the center console. If you look at the center console storage, you can see it has a massive lid, and you can even lock it. Undoubtedly, you can stick stuff in there and hide it from people, except when you open the lid, you can see it's very small. Most of it is like 1/4 of an inch deep, and you could barely fit papers there. There's a tiny little part in front where you can actually stick stuff, and where there's actually storage, there's just no room in here. Now, I want to discuss the reason for this and the reason why this centerpiece is so massively wide, and that's because there's a lot of important stuff underneath here. You see, when the government was looking for a military vehicle, they wanted as much ground clearance as possible. And so AM General, who originally developed this vehicle, they had to move a lot of important running gear and drivetrain components in to this center area. And that's why the seats are so far apart, because there are many crucial elements to the running gear, which in your car are on the floor, but they're brought up in the Hummer so that there's more ground clearance and better off-road capabilities for combat use for the military. Now, it's worth noting that when the H1 was adapted for civilian use, its purpose changed quite a bit, and it was luxurified, if you will. This one has been modified with even more luxury features than a regular one. For instance, it has a backup camera. Shift into reverse, there's a giant screen in the middle of the windshield that will show you what's behind you, which is nice since this thing is so big. You also have Home Link, which means you can program your garage door opener into your Hummer, which is laughable because nobody's garage is big enough to fit one of these things anyway, but at least you can do it. And this one even has an aftermarket blind spot monitor. Check this out. On the back of the truck, in the rear quarter panel, you can see there's this little thing that looks out. When you put on your turn signal, it's monitoring to see if any vehicles are back there, and if it notices one, it will beep in the front so you can tell if something's coming up behind. That's a pretty impressive feature, and again, this one a lot more luxurious than its original military purpose. Now, with that said, you can add as many luxury features as you want, but it's hard to disguise this vehicle's true utilitarian roots. For example, the hazard light switch, not just a regular button. Instead, it's this little switch under the steering column that you pull down to activate the hazard lights. You don't see that in any type of modern vehicles. And how about the parking brake, which is basically just a metal lever that sticks up from the center console? Again, not very modern. The thin doors, another fantastic example. There's not even an armrest on these doors where you can rest your arm while you drive, which is a mistake that no modern vehicle would ever make for comfort's sake, but when they were designing this, they weren't really thinking about that. And it's the same story with the wipers. In most modern vehicles, they hide underneath the hood to give you a better look and better aerodynamics. In this thing, they just sit there. They're always kind of out in the open, blocking a little of your vision. And when you put them on, they make this U pattern like a city bus. They absolutely do not look modern or luxury like this vehicle is kind of trying to be. And next we move on to the back of the H1, and it's here that you can really see the issues this thing has with interior space. I have the front passenger seat placed exactly where I would be sitting, and I didn't have much room up there, but sitting back here behind it, I have truly no room. I can't even get my knees behind the front passenger seat in this incredibly expensive luxury vehicle. It's just a terrible use of space because, again, it was never designed to be a comfortable highway civilian vehicle. Now, one interesting thing to note about the back seat is right here, you can see this is a pretty good idea of what to do with all this extra width you have in the back seat. You can mount extra seats. And a lot of Hummer H1 owners decide to do this because it's better than wasted space. So this thing has 2 additional rear seats, meaning you have 4 seats across back here, none of which are particularly comfortable, but at least you can carry 6 people in this thing. Now, one other interesting item worth noting in these Alpha models, they really wanted to try to make it as luxurious as possible, even in the back seats. And so rear passengers have their own climate control vent. They have their own power window switch. They have cup holders, and there's even a place where you can plug in headphones and listen to your own music, AM, FM, CD, whatever. That was the biggest luxury they could imagine back in 2006. Frankly, I would have just preferred more legroom somehow. Ugh. Now, next we move on to the outside of the H1, where there are a couple of interesting quirks and features. I want to start with the 3 orange lights above the windshield. Regulations here in the United States say that a vehicle over a certain width is classified as a commercial vehicle and must have these orange lights for improved safety and visibility. So you see them on like box trucks and cargo trucks and the H1 because it's so massively wide that by regulation it has to have these lights. Interestingly, the Ford F-150 Raptor is also wide enough to meet this standard, and so Ford also puts these 3 middle orange lights on the Raptor too. And if you've ever wondered why some vehicles have them, there's your answer. Now, next we move on to the cargo area in this thing, which is really shockingly small. They sold the Alphas in 2 different configurations. You could get a 4-door station wagon that looked like a normal SUV, or you could get the soft top with like a pickup bed. And to get in here, you have to undo these little clips. There's one on the other side too. And then you put it down and you can put your things back here. But again, not all that big, nowhere near as big as a normal pickup truck. Now, you could at one point get the Hummer as a normal pickup truck with like a pickup cab and then a real pickup bed, but I don't think the Alpha was ever offered like that. You had to choose between these 2 body styles. Now, one of the interesting things that compromises the Alpha's cargo area back here is width. Even though this thing is massively wide, you can't actually use the whole width of the cargo area. There's like 2 feet on either side that kind of pinches it in. So you might be thinking, well, why is that? I was curious and I looked around and kind of poked underneath and I realized that on the driver's side, the exhaust is integrated into this space. It goes over the tire and next to the cargo area, and then it goes out the back. So they couldn't make it all the way wide enough because the exhaust is there. Presumably it's placed in that spot so it doesn't go too low and interfere with the ground clearance. And that wasn't the only decision made for better ground clearance. There are 2 more impressive ones you can see up here. One is the fact that this thing has portal axles. Now, in a normal lifted SUV, even when you lift it up, the axle is kind of the weak point because it always has to be right in the middle of the wheels. But when you have portal axles, you actually move the axles up from the center of the wheel, and then it attaches through some gears, and that gives you a few extra inches of ground clearance. This is tremendously expensive. Most people who lift their vehicles do not add portal axles, but when you're making something for the military to go as far off-road as you can, you do in this thing. And another really impressive feature up in the front, the H1 has inboard brakes. Basically, every other vehicle has brakes that sit right at the wheel, but not this. You can see the brakes are like 6, 10, 12 inches inside there. Most cars skip this because it's a problem for maintenance, for heat, but in this case, getting the brakes out of the way also allowed for slightly better ground clearance, which was the most important thing when developing the H1, the Hummer, for combat situations. And another interesting feature the Hummer has that most normal vehicles don't have, you can see there is one fuel filler here, and there is another fuel filler here, and they go to 2 separate fuel tanks, and you can switch between them with a little switch in the interior next to the steering wheel. Now, obviously, this gives you more range than a regular vehicle with only 1 fuel tank. You fill them both up, you're out off-roading in some crazy treacherous situation, you run out of fuel in 1 tank, you just press the button and switch to the other one instead of having to limp back to the nearest town to get more fuel. This is another major benefit in combat situations where you might not have access to fuel for a long period of time. And next up, we move on to opening the hood, the engine cover in the H1 Alpha, to see its most valuable asset, its Duramax diesel engine. And opening the hood is actually a surprisingly complicated process. First, you remove these pins at the very front of the H1 so that you can fold away its steel brush bar that protects it from damage when you're off-roading. Then you undo these little latches, one on the passenger side of the engine cover and one over here on the driver's side. Then you're ready to just open it right up, except you can't because it's locked. You see, they didn't want just anybody to be able to walk up and open the engine cover and have access to the engine of a Hummer. And so there is a little lock inside the driver's footwell. You have to pull it, and that will unlock the engine cover, and only then can you open it up. Now, before I open up the engine cover, there are two interesting things that I want to point out that I absolutely love up here. One, these hooks. These hooks are part of the chassis of this thing. They are structural. As you can see, I move them and the whole vehicle shakes. These hooks are designed to allow this thing to be dropped by a helicopter connected to a parachute, and then it will just sail to the ground to provide Humvees for troops in forward combat. You don't see those on a Honda Pilot. The other thing I love is the fact that they finished with making the engine cover and then they realized there was nowhere to put your hands to lift it. And so they have this little cutout in the engine cover of all Hummers, and it looks like this crappy unfinished thing, but again, it was never designed to look luxurious or nice. It was functional, and that's all you needed. But anyway, you stick your hand in this little cutout and then you pull and it's open. And once the engine cover is open, you can see it, the Duramax diesel heavy-duty pickup truck engine that was stuck inside the H1 in 2006. This engine made 300 horsepower and 520 pound-feet of torque. Now, those numbers may not seem like all that much, especially by modern standards, but it's a huge upgrade over previous models. The early civilian Hummer models had a naturally aspirated diesel that made something like 150 horsepower and 250 pound-feet of torque. It was nowhere near enough to move this thing. It did 0 to 60 in like 16 seconds, and it wasn't until 06 that it finally got the engine it deserved. Now, it's worth noting, in 06, all of the Hummer H1s were Alpha models, but again, it was only 06. So if you have an 06, you have an Alpha. All the other model years are very much inferior, and that's especially true when you look at pricing and see how much more the Alpha models sell for. And one other interesting quirk that I like, when you open up the passenger door, you can see this little label here. This is the emission label that basically says it was certified by the EPA for sale, whatever. But I especially like the logo they use for Hummer. You can see it says Hummer, and then above that, there's a picture of one of these with a guy on the turret with a machine gun, just in case you needed a reminder that you have this cool, brutish military vehicle. Just check your emissions label, and there's the reminder you need. And so those are the quirks and features of the 2006 Hummer H1 Alpha. Now it's time to get it out on the road and see how it drives. All right, driving the H1 Alpha. You know, I owned a 95 AM General Hummer, old school, barely different from the military one, except that it had power windows and a radio and air conditioning. And I've always wondered what the Alpha was like, because mine was like a $30,000 truck, but these sell for $150,000, $200,000, $250,000. It just, everything feels better, tighter, higher quality than my old one. That's in large part owed to the powertrain, which just makes the whole experience a lot smoother. This was the only motor this truck ever should have had. Flooring it here. Whoa. I can't believe a Hummer is going this fast. Mine was so indescribably slow. That was absolutely incredible. I cannot believe how fast that is. That almost surprises me more than like flooring it in a Veyron, because I know how big this is, and you're fighting aerodynamics so dramatically. I mean, it's just a block. It was never designed for civilian use. It was never intended for gas mileage or highway driving. And I cannot believe how fast it is with this powertrain. And by no means is it fast, but it feels like a CR-V or a Pilot or a normal car, and that's incredible to me because you're moving so much weight. Driving along on the highway, you do have some of the shaking that I had in my old one, but it does feel like a much more reasonable, normal vehicle. And the big difference is you just feel like you have so much additional torque. It doesn't quite feel as stable or as luxurious as I was kind of hoping for, and I think as buyers probably would kind of hope for, I don't have to put up with any of the BS of the Hummer. Well, it still drives like a vehicle that was engineered in 1983 and is a block for aerodynamics. And I bet it gets horrible mileage even with the Duramax and the 5-speed. The Alpha is the one you want. If you don't want to put up with problems, if you want to just be able to take it to a Chevy dealer and get it serviced, this is the one, and it will last forever. The Duramax with the 5-speed auto. And so that's the Hummer H1 Alpha. These things were the ultimate Hummers, and a lot of people really do think they are the ultimate off-roaders, and they have a huge following among people who truly want the best that Hummer had to offer. And now it's time to give the H1 Alpha a Doug score. Starting with the weekend categories and styling, the H1 Alpha isn't for everyone, but it's very distinctive and pretty cool, and it gets a 6 out of 10. Acceleration, it's improved from the regular one, but still pretty slow, and it gets a 1 out of 10. Handling is terrible. The only single positive thing I can say about it is that it's not especially dangerous, and it gets a 2 out of 10. Fun factor is high. You can take off the roof and go deep off-roading or forward streams or whatever, and it gets an 8 out of 10. Cool factor is also high. These remain cool 25 years after the civilian Hummer went on sale, and the Alpha is the coolest of the bunch. It gets a 7 out of 10 for a total weekend score of 24 out of 50. Next up are the daily categories and features. The H1 Alpha is low on modern tech, and it gets a 3 out of 10. Comfort is really bad. The interior is insanely tight, and the seats aren't particularly comfortable, and it gets a 3 out of 10. Quality is a mixed bag. The interior is mediocre, but the drivetrain is tremendously reliable, and it gets a 7 out of 10. Practicality is mediocre. Yes, this seat's 6, but it's also too wide to bring it anywhere, and it has no realistically usable cargo area. It gets a 6 out of 10. Finally, value, and this one is hard to rate. At $150,000 to $250,000, these are insanely expensive for what they are, but they're also only going up, and it gets a 6 out of 10 for a total daily score of 25 out of 50. Added up, and the Doug score is 49 out of 100, which places it here against some other absurd trucks and SUVs. The Hummer H1 Alpha is very much an acquired taste, and it's not a great vehicle unless you're really, really into it. But if you are, few other things even come close.